Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here, and this is the first presentation on for the Modern Germany course, History 437. This class is going to be taught very much like a roots and origins of Nazi Germany in the Second World War more than anything else. Though everything that we emphasize in the class is not going to deal with the rise of the Nazis. We're going to start, as you'll see from the readings, we're going to start by reading significantly about developments during the 19th century in the origin of German nationalism. But the class overall is going to really run from the 19th century through World War II, and of course we'll have a section 2 to consider the long-term ramifications of this. In a lot of respects, what this class is about the creation of a nation and how nationalism can be used to create a consolidated nation amongst an area that politically was very broken up, but also how nationalism can turn into extreme forms ultimately, like fascism, and create the tremendous problems that were experienced in the 1930s and the 1940s, most significantly. Germany, when we think about the creation of the German nation, when we think about what it means in the sense of nationalism, what it means to be a nation means that the people of a nation all participate in imagined identity with the rest of a national group, a group of people that they cannot see or talk to, and so forth, at least not directly. So nationalism, when we think about this new creation, and in many respects, Germany is part of a movement of the construction and creation of new types of national entities that really begins most earnestly with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Germany, Italy, modern countries like this are just like Great Britain, just like the United States, just like France. They are, in ways, they're products of a new era of nation that broke from the tradition of monarchy and hereditary nobility, or of church authority for that matter. So when we think about, and this is why I show you this map here, you see really early versions of at least the historical roots of Germany. This map depicts the three kingdoms that broke up among the sons of King Charlemagne in the 9th century after Charlemagne's death in, I believe, 814. Common Era. And so the reason I have this here is because it's something to think about. What does it mean for a nation to be a nation? There's really two types of nationalism. One is a civic nationalism. And a civic nationalism basically means that the people of a country participate in shared notions of government, of freedom, of justice, and so forth. That they all agree on these things, and that despite their ethnicities and religions and these types of things, they all consolidate as a nation under these basic symbols and principles. Ethnic nationalism is where what links the nation together is a particular ethnicity. And as we see the development of German nationalism, we see that ethnic nationalism increasingly becomes the predominant mode of unity for the German nation. So this was a long-term development in which the people who were ultimately going to be considered truly German were not people who could so forth get a passport and become a German citizen, but rather people who were part of what was known as the German Volk, or the German people. And so Germany is unified largely under an ethnic nationalism. This is so Germany as a country didn't exist really in any real sense until really 1871. We're not even going to get to the actual unification of Germany in today's topic, but the German nation is a very recent development. Throughout the almost 1,000 years of the Holy Roman Empire. This is in medieval Europe, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment period, and so forth. Central Europe, the place where we call Germany today, was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not a single nation, but rather it was a collection of many different kingdoms that were loosely controlled by an outside power, the Holy Roman Emperor, and ultimately this is going to be linked through the Austrian royal house. To give you a notion of this, in the early 1500s, the king of the Holy Roman Empire was Charles V. Charles V was the Austrian king, the Habsburg house, but he was also the king of Spain, the king of the king of all the kingdoms that we consider to be part of Germany, the king of the Netherlands, of Belgium, and all, of course, also Italy, but all of Spain's New World claims as well. So Germany as a nation doesn't really consolidate until very late in the kind of modern era of nation creating. In fact, not until 1871 is when the formal German nation comes into being. But, of course, it was building on developments that had occurred throughout the 19th century. Prussia, which is in the shaded areas here, and the shaded areas kind of depict the expansion of Prussian influence. Prussia, which becomes well known in the 19th century for the Junker class, which was a leadership class in northeastern Europe, northeastern Central Europe. The Prussians will become the part of these collections of German kingdoms that will ultimately be the most significant in unifying the German nation. It will be the Prussians who are ultimately going to be the most significant when it comes to unifying Germany. The Prussians were aristocratic, landowning elites from Prussia, the Junkers, which were these landed aristocratic elites from Prussia, will largely lead this unification in the latter 1800s. These individuals in the area of Prussia have become known for its state and bureaucratic authoritarianism. And Prussia was the most exceptional when it came to military strategy during this time. They were famous for their exceptional drill masters and their powerful leaders like Frederick the Great, who is depicted in this painting. The Prussians also were able to use the common market, which was established in Germany as a kind of zone, a trade zone, an economic zone within central Germany. It was able to monopolize influence and control over that in the 1800s, and that also gave it kind of an economic foothold in which the Junker class is going to increasingly assert themselves in the politics of organizing the German Confederation. And ultimately, it will be Otto von Bismarck, the Junker, who will lead the unification of Germany, particularly by vilifying so-called despots internally, but largely also through waging wars against common enemies abroad, like France. During the Napoleonic age, the map of Europe in a lot of respects, and of the world actually, was quite revolutionized. Napoleon took power in France after the end of, or at the latter stages of the French Revolution. In ways, Napoleon carried on aspects of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, of course, which began in 1789, technically July 14th, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille, I suppose we would say, is the beginning of the French Revolution. But the French Revolution was, and it's often remembered for being a very radical revolution. We oftentimes think about the Convention with Robespierre and the guillotine. But the French Revolution was a liberal revolution that was in the exact same vein as the American Revolution, which was its other sister liberal revolution. And by liberal, we mean a revolution as in inspired by the concepts of the Enlightenment, which was the idea that states should be run by rationality, by a limitation of monarchical or bureaucratic authority, and the enhancement of individual freedom to choose one's government, fairness and justice in the court systems, certain natural rights within a state. And so these liberal governments ultimately create reforms that in the long term create a trend of liberal influence. When I say liberal, I mean influenced by the Enlightenment. Liberal as in natural rights, as in individual freedom, representative government, these types of things. It created a trend that influenced Europe well into the 1800s. It also influenced the Americas. When Napoleon conquered all of Europe, he actually put in place some significant influence throughout Europe and in the Americas. In the Americas, the monarchical powers of Spain, for example, lost all of their possessions. And that gave the ability for there to be liberal revolutions in places like South America and Central America, led by people like Simón Bolívar. In Europe, of course, the Prussians and the Germans, they never, as a whole, really celebrated France. German nationalism is, to a large degree, a creation of that is built on the vilification of not only domestic monarchical despots trying to control Germany as a police state from inside, but German nationalism is also a product of is something that's created against invading outside forces. And so Germans very much were opposed to the French when the French are invading Germany. But through the French Revolution, through this destabilization, you see the insertion into Germany from the influence of France of really, really profound ideas of the Enlightenment. And these were ideas, revolutionary ideas relating to constitutional governments, to governments that protect people's individual rights, to the ability of Germany to create states that were not monarchies and were free of outside control. So Napoleon, during the Napoleonic phase, which Napoleon was kind of a moderated extension of the French Revolution, Napoleon, of course, will conquer effectively all of Europe. Ultimately, what ultimately did Napoleon in was trying to conquer Russia in 1812. Germany was thoroughly conquered by Napoleon, as Napoleon completely dominated the continent. Well, after Napoleon was defeated, the Congress of Vienna, which was a collection of nations led most by the Austrian Prince Clemens von Metternich, was really in charge of overseeing the post-Napoleonic world. And Metternich, who was really the diplomat who spearheaded the Congress of Vienna, created the Congress of Vienna as a conservative order that was really designed to maintain stability in Austrian power. And he sought to do this by maintaining the status quo and preventing radical liberal revolutions, which Metternich saw as a threat to stability in Europe. He wanted to empower the status quo, monarchs, and leaders in the country, in Austria as well as in Central, I shouldn't say country, and in the kingdoms of Central Europe, and through police and military power, prevent a destabilization of the region through radical and liberal-minded revolutionary thought, which was a product of the French Revolution. Remember, the French Revolution was a revolution that was about liberal concepts of freedom of the individual, of representative constitutional government, of ideas of governments that do not infringe on people's natural individual rights. It was really a revolution when it came to how societies organize themselves, as much as it was a sort of violent revolution. It was a revolution of ideas about freedoms of the individuals, about the nature of government, and so forth. And after the end of the Napoleonic age, these ideas continued to influence Europe and motivated revolutions across the continent. And Metternich understood the revolutionary nature of these ideas, and he understood that in a lot of cases, nationalist revolutions would be almost impossible to prevent. Nationalism, in the sense of creating your own German nation that was separate from the control of an outside power, so to speak, and was based on a constitutional representative system, that was a liberal idea. And for Metternich, that was a radical idea and a dangerous idea to his power and to Austria's power. And he went to great lengths to try to prevent that. Within Germany, there was a division between aspects of conservatism, of liberals, and of groups that would be considered radical groups. The radical movement was particularly dominant in universities. Students and professors created political associations that I'm going to mention here in just a minute on a specific slide. And these political associations promoted, nationalism and promoted an undermining of the conservative status quo. Metternich was very concerned with these radical professors and their students, and actually policed universities. Radical professors were arrested. Student organizations were disbanded. Metternich very much saw higher education and the university system as a place where radical thought could undermine the status quo by delivering and deploying these new ideas of nationalism and of government and of individuality. However, for Metternich, the bigger problem were not these kind of pockets of radical students and professors. And I'm not to say that all the radicals were students and professors, just that was one of the dominant areas. But his biggest problem was actually with the liberal movement, which the liberal movement was based on individualism. It was often based on promoting representative governments that protected the rights of individuals, and also that protected individuals from the abuses of the system, of an industrializing system too. Liberals often promoted kind of the general welfare of society as the end goal. Other liberals too promoted economic liberalism, which was kind of the idea of free market individual capitalism, which was oftentimes a dominant variation of liberalism in Europe. Conservatives often feared economic liberalism as much as other groups. In some respects, even socialists and conservatives both had a deep fear of industrialism and of economic liberalism, because of the devastation wrought on land and population because of it. Of course, the revolutionary socialist movements were extremely different from the conservatives, but they both were concerned about the exploits of private enterprise industrialism. Though some industrialists made a tremendous amount of money getting into the industries in places like Silesia, which was one of the early industrial sectors of Germany. Later it would be outpaced by the Ruhr area. So liberalism was a big danger to Metternich, more of a danger than the radical movements on the universities, because liberalism was more widespread, and because of its individualist nature and its promoting of oftentimes the common good and of constitutional representative governments and economic freedom, it was a fundamental danger to the status quo power that Metternich hoped to maintain. This is a look, and I'll go back and I'll talk about conservatives, liberals, and radicals in just a second, but this is a look at the German Confederation as it was established by the Congress of Vienna. So it's a large area. It's a hodgepodge of different kingdoms, and it is a mix of different types of political viewpoints. And in a lot of ways, the unifying factor for this area will be leadership from Prussia combined with challenges of external authority, outside control, and various concepts of liberal government. In ideology, this is really the moment where we see the birth of the concept of conservative versus liberal. And now it's an important thing to remember that conservative and liberal do not mean the exact same things that they mean now. There are some things that are shared, but they don't mean the exact same thing in terms of politics as they meant in, say, Germany during the 19th century. So an ideology is a, quote, coherent vision of human nature, human society, and the larger world that proposes some particular form of political and social organization as ideal. Following the fall of Napoleon and the establishment of the Congress of Vienna, you really have seen, you will see the solidifying of a battle between two ideologies, conservatism and liberalism. Conservatism's founder was Edmund Burke, more or less, and Edmund Burke was reacting largely to the radicalism of things like the American and French revolutions. Though he did tend to say that the American Revolution was natural change, he nonetheless saw the French Revolution as unnatural change. Conservatives at this time are actually opposed not only to Enlightenment revolutions, but they're also oftentimes, not all the time, but eventually they change, but they're opposed to industrialism. Industrialism creates a lot of problems. It upsets the balance of the system. And so conservatives at this time tended to simply oppose radical change. And so they opposed revolutions. They imposed Enlightenment revolutions to change the world. They favored backing the status quo and preventing short-term change and instead insisting on long-term change. And so they tended to resist not only revolutions, liberal revolutions like the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Greek Revolution, which happens in the 1820s, but also the development of industrialism as well, the industrialization. Liberalism's primary founder is oftentimes considered John Stuart Mill. And in the 1800s, this becomes increasingly a viewpoint in which, John Stuart Mill was one of the founders with Jeremy Bentham of utilitarianism, which puts forth the idea that the best decisions are those that benefit society over individuals benefiting the most. Liberalism tended to be about individual freedom. Liberalism was about creating states and governments that were less bureaucratic, that were non-monarchical, that enhanced the freedom of people's individual rights and protected them through representative government and proper forms of, fair forms of justice. So liberals tended to, and sometimes liberals also oppose industrialization, but generally liberals tended to be in favor of individual freedom, creating governments that were representative, and enhancing the freedom of the individual. And so they oftentimes promoted private individual capitalism in these types of things over the kind of status quo hierarchical society. Instead, they believed in creating representative societies in which people could move up and down the society on the basis of how well they're able to succeed in a more or less fair individual society. I hope that makes sense. The Industrial Revolution really changes things in the 19th century. And even though at the time of the French Revolution, we might think of liberals, Enlightenment thinkers as the radicals, by the middle of the 1850s, in some respects, the liberals have become more of the moderates. And there's a new movement that we'd actually call radicals, who really react to the changes in society caused by the Industrial Revolution. And these are individuals like Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, these types of thinkers. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed life for people everywhere, and Germany was often late to the party in all of this. Germany's late to the party when it comes to becoming a formal nation. They're also late to the party when it comes to becoming industrialized. Germany didn't have its first railroad until 1835, whereas England was some 3 decades ahead of that. England was very much at the fore of the Industrial Revolution, and it really led the way in this respect. And England, as an example in the Industrial Revolution, actually very much influenced Germany. There were some individuals in Germany, conservatives, for example, early conservatives, who looked at the kind of ugliness of English industrialized society and basically said, we don't want to do that because extreme poverty, air pollution, very, very bad for workers. Germany was at this time still, in many cases, dominated by the family sector and work, and by local guilds that effectively, controlled certain aspects of pre-industrial manufacture and did so with better wages and conditions for its people. There was a resistance to this, and actually it's kind of an ironic thing that conservatives at the beginning of the 19th century, in some respects, had similar feelings as the radicals, the socialists, for example, like Karl Marx, of the mid-1850s when it came to thinking about the realities of industrialization, that it was ugly and exploitative and undermined the people. The development of industrialism, changes the way people live. It ultimately forces, it encourages people to move around more, because people go where the jobs are. Labor is generally less skilled, which drives wages down. Work is usually more mundane and often more dangerous. A factory industrial society is more rigid. There becomes a greater divide between the public and private sector, the home and work. Whereas before, the home kind of provided all aspects. It provided work. It provided certain social support, these types of things. Industrialism separates the private from the home, and in the process, ultimately, the state will increasingly provide things that were once before provided by the home. At least ultimately, that will be the case. But a separation of the public and the private sphere. Increasingly, women in industrialization are pushed into domesticity, and so the Industrial Revolution actually has a very negative impact from the perspective of workers. There are conservatives and liberals who get involved, obviously, in the new machine age in places like Silesia in Germany, and make a lot of money on the new technology. But Germany remained kind of a hodgepodge where industrialization in life was changing certain places and other places were falling behind. The process of industrialism also, like, fewer people own homes. Population goes up. People are more mobile. Labor is often more readily available. Wages tend to go down. So it has a very distinct impact on culture. And oftentimes there are revolts in industrial societies. The Luddite revolt in England. There was a similar revolt in Germany, as the machines put formerly skilled activities out. It puts the old home guild industries, home and town guild industries, effectively out of business. And so it's a pretty traumatic impact on life in Germany. And by the middle of the 1800s, there will be major revolutions that sweep across Europe, and particularly in Germany, in 1848. And increasingly, these revolutions are liberal and radical revolutions that are designed, or at least their intent was to improve the situation for the most people. And so you see, at that time, you see many liberals and radicals promoting the more utilitarian idea that the goal should be to improve living conditions, improve the status and conditions for the people, as industrialism had made them very desperate. The Industrial Revolution, as well as the conquest from Napoleon before, but particularly the dislocations caused by the Industrial Revolution, encouraged the development in Germany of politically liberal and illegal associations, often illegal associations, like the Gymnasts, the Museum Association. There are also a number of workers' associations. So when the Industrial Revolution fundamentally transforms German society, so German society used to be very close-knit, in which the home and work were often intertwined, and in which, people's work and people's ways of life were to a large degree protected by the Guild Association. Well, the Industrial Revolution really changed all of that. Laborers moved to where the jobs were. Less people owned homes. The family and the work was dislocated. And so the society could no longer rely on very fundamental pre-industrial organizations. To fill this gap, political associations developed. And political associations were basically like groups of people that got together and socialized and discussed politics and these types of things. They were fundamentally, in a lot of respects, fundamentally liberal in the sense that they generally supported the creation of a constitutional nation, which at this time, creating a constitutional representative Germany was fundamentally a liberal endeavor, and it went against the conservative status quo that was led by Clemens von Metternich of the German Confederation. And so these political associations were generally illegal, but they were used by the people as a way of bringing the society back together after it had faced such powerful dislocations to basic domestic behavior. And so some of the most common associations were the Gymnasts, for example, who were led by educators like Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, who used these organizations, which was open to everybody. It was a pretty radical organization to promote unity, to promote moral fiber and strong will and mind of the German people. There were also groups like the Museum Association. There were workers' associations that promoted unity among workers and in a lot of respects were precursors to the development of unions. These groups provided an avenue for political association as well as for socialization. And so they would ultimately become seen by this conservative status quo as somewhat subversive. And in a lot of respects, they were creating the kind of grounds for the creation of formal political parties within Germany. In addition to that, they were also really piecing together a German national identity as well. Of course, another really important form of political thought that branched out of ultimately aspects of the liberal tradition in Europe was, of course, Marxism. Marxism was ultimately, during this time period, associated really with more radical segments of society, whereas liberals were increasingly more moderate, or at least perceived as such in their approach. This is Karl Marx pictured here, and Marxism is generally known as revolutionary socialism. Socialism, utopian socialism, had been a kind of aspect of the liberal movement throughout much of the 1800s. And many liberals, even though some liberals promoted kind of private sector, Adam Smith capitalism, many liberals in the 1800s were placing the well-being of the society as the foremost kind of goal over even private and individual capitalism. So revolutionary socialism was a branch of this, and before revolutionary socialism, there was very famously utopian socialism, in which the theorists of utopian socialism promoted concepts of classless societies and utopian societies. And Marxism was a bit different than that, seeing the utopian socialists as somewhat unrealistic. Utopian socialists often sought to create communities that effectively ignored the changes of the Industrial Revolution, and Marx saw that as just not realistic. Marx, who, remember, he was not writing in Germany. He is German, but he's not writing in Germany. He's writing in England. And he's reacting to the incredibly dirty and repressive reality of industrial England. Karl Marx ultimately he would be considered not only a philosopher, but he would be considered a historian, and a very highly influential historian. For a long, long time in the academy, there were historians that were effectively Marxist in their understanding of history. And what that means is that a Marxist believes that history is a deterministic path. And guys like Karl Marx actually were influenced by other German philosophers during this time period, the middle of the 1800s, like Hegel. And Hegel had a very elaborate understanding of a deterministic process in history. So Karl Marx believed that all human societies had to pass through industrialism, industrial capitalism. That's why he thought the utopians were unrealistic. The utopians, like the Silesian loom workers who rioted against the process of industrialization, the utopians turning away from industrialism, in his perspective, was naive and unrealistic. Instead, Karl Marx believed that history moved through a deterministic practice. It moved from monarchy, and then monarchy would ultimately become so repressive that the people would rise up and they'd construct a new system. And that was the system of capitalism and industrial capitalism, which was the time in which Marx was writing. Marx believed these were necessary phases. After industrial capitalism, this system, according to Marx, would become so repressive on the people that the proletariat, the so-called working classes, would rise up and create a workers' socialism. And eventually the workers' socialism would give way through effectively a historical evolutionary process to a true communism, which would take hundreds of years to establish. Marx never believed in an immediate move to this, but rather he believed he was effectively describing the deterministic path of history. There aren't very many Marxist historians today, simply because historians generally reject the notion that there are these predetermined phases of history. Increasingly, historians believe that history is contingent and can go multiple directions at any given time, and so we tend to not believe in a deterministic historical past. But Karl Marx was, even though he's writing in England, Karl Marx, writing with Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx is part of a movement that's deeply influential in Germany. And both revolutionary socialism and reform socialism is basically a moderate like socialism that's designed to reform representative capitalist societies. But these have a very strong trend, and you would refer to them as maybe liberals, or you might refer to them in the context of being radical because of contrasting them with mainstream liberals. But this movement was very, very dominant in Europe, in Germany, in Central Germany, and the revolutionary socialist movement, the reform socialist movement, will be really a fundamental component to the interworkings of the German nation, even though there is never in the period we're talking about, I'm not going to say, well, none of the governments in the period that we're talking about are revolutionary socialist in Germany. They adopt aspects of reform socialism at times, but generally revolutionary socialists were a nuisance within Germany, but they were reacting to the conditions of the day, and they were a very significant political faction within Germany during the time that we're talking about. Note, remember, revolutionary socialism is not the same as National Socialism, guys. So this class, we are ultimately going to be talking about the development of Nazi Germany, okay? National Socialism, or the Nazi Party movement, is not the same as revolutionary socialism. They are very, very different. And actually, the revolutionary socialists and the communists were the primary enemies of the Nazis. That's kind of one of the great misnomers of this era, is that revolutionary socialism and National Socialism were the same. They were not the same. So, one of the sort of outcast people of European society in general had been for a long, long time, obviously, the Jewish population. Jewish people had faced a number of repressions, religious repression largely during the period of the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church dominated, and well and up to the eve of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an Enlightenment revolution. It was, in many respects, it was about granting greater rights in representative societies to people. And the French Revolution led to a process of granting civil rights to Jewish individuals. Jewish people faced opposition within Germany quite relatively frequently during the first half of the 19th century. Though increasingly Prussian reformers and educated Germans supported granting full civil rights to Jewish individuals. And after the revolutions of 1848, Jewish individuals are increasingly granted full civil rights within Germany, and they face less and less violence. During this time period, we don't really see yet the development of the future kind of racially motivated anti-Semitism. We don't see that as much yet. Jewish individuals assimilated into German culture. Some also migrated to the United States. They were very effective with upper mobility. The Jewish people really, during the 1800s, moved from being peddlers and money changers to being bankers who were incredibly powerful within German society. The Jewish population increased in Germany by the 1860s, and they increasingly made up an integral part of the German world. And it is not yet where we really see the emergence of the virulent racist anti-Semitism that you'll see particularly mobilized by the Nazis when they rise to power. We don't see that yet. Instead, we see a Jewish community that is industriously establishing itself, in which Jewish individuals are going to sometimes great lengths of assimilation to become part of German society, and in which reformers and educated Germans and Prussians really promote and achieve the granting of civil rights to them in Germany during this time period.